Okay. Thanks for joining, everyone. We'll just give this a minute for more people to join in, and then we'll start with our webinar. Mhm. Okay. Okay, Ravi. So we have about 80 people so far. We'll go ahead and start, and we'll let people join in the meanwhile. So thanks everyone for joining. I'll just give a quick intro. For those of you who are joining a First Principles session for the first time, I'll just tell you what it is. First Principles is a product webinar by Gojek with a mission to build a platform to share ideas, learnings, and mistakes, and host people such as Ravi to learn from their expertise. Uh, Thank you so much, Ravi, for joining today. It's really early for you, so thank you. We're really grateful that you could join. Uh, a quick intro about Ravi. So Ravi is the consumer tech leader who has scaled products at companies like Tinder, Facebook, Microsoft, just to name a few, and has impacted literally millions of people. I'll share his blog link where he shares extremely detailed learnings through uh, from his career. And yeah, over to you, Ravi. Please, if it would be good if you can give an intro as well and cover the points, which of course I would have missed.
That sounds good. Thank you for having me. I'm extremely excited to be here. So today we're going to talk about what I've learned about making great products. And ultimately what I found about making great products is that it's about making great product decisions. So I'm going to talk about the 3 pillars of product decision making. And I'll talk partly from my experience, but I've also put together cases from around the world of technology that help to illustrate examples of good decision making and sometimes when decision making goes wrong. So really excited to go through the topic today. I'll go through the slides and then we'll have questions towards the end.
Perfect.
So a little bit about me. So I've spent my career building consumer tech products. I got started in the tech industry before it was really an industry. My dad brought home a computer when I was 9 years old. There wasn't much to do on it other than to learn how to program. So I learned how to program an Apple IIc when I was young. At the time, I started making games. I did that all through high school, and then into college, I started doing that commercially. So I started a game company and built games, had a commercial publisher in the US as well as outside the US. I dropped out of college a little bit to do that full time, then went back to college to finish up my degree. And at the time that I graduated, I was talking to a number of companies. It was a really good time to graduate. It was right in the middle of the first web bubble. So there was lots of opportunities. But I started talking to Microsoft and they said, look, we're going to be making a multi-billion-dollar investment into games. We can't really talk about what it is, but we're looking for people that love games and have experience in that business. And so I joined Microsoft. I learned shortly after joining that it was the Xbox team. And so I joined the Xbox team as one of the first few members on the team. Spent a lot of time thinking about Xbox Live and what Microsoft could do to really advance the state of multiplayer gaming, considering that it was one of the areas where Microsoft felt like it had a competitive advantage relative to Sony and Nintendo. I was there for about 6 years in a product management role the entire time, after which I decided to go to business school. And post-business school, I wanted to get back to building things in smaller startups. So I did a series of startups, one of which was a startup for the financial services industry. And then the second of which was a startup for the social gaming industry. We founded the company right around the time that iOS or Apple had released the App Store. and right around the time that Facebook had released their platform. And so we were doing a lot to help enable social games to monetize their audience directly. And then for the last 10 years or so, I've been at larger companies. I spent about 5 years at TripAdvisor, where I led the consumer product team and managed that team through a period of really significant growth. This was shortly after TripAdvisor rolled out from Expedia and was an independent public company. And as a result, there were a whole set of things from a strategic perspective the company could do that made sense as an independent company, but didn't make sense as part of TripAdvisor. So really exciting time to be there, help to scale the team and really scale the product. And then for the last 3 or so years, I focused on Gen Z. So I joined a team at Facebook called the Youth Team, which is specifically focused on 13 to 18-year-olds and how they use social media. We spent a lot of time understanding both what they were doing on Facebook as well as what they were doing elsewhere in their lives on YouTube and Musical.ly and other places where they were spending time. And then about a year ago, I joined Tinder as the chief product officer, helping Tinder think about where social discovery and online dating is going for young people, and really helping to level up the product organization, bring in solid product leadership, and put into place really good product processes. So, I left in February. I've been doing a number of things, really thinking about what I want to do next and getting back to those startup roots.
Great.
So along the way, I've had a chance to see a lot of products. Some go well, some not go well. And ultimately, the ingredients to a product that does really well is really good product decision making. And ultimately, it's about making decisions that deliver value for the customer and for the business, striking that balance between thinking both about what the company is trying to accomplish strategically as well as what the user is trying to accomplish is really important. Oftentimes companies can bias towards one or the other. And ultimately, as a result of that, not build something that's either as valuable as it needs to be for the company or as valuable as it needs to be for the customer. And over the years, I've developed this framework in terms of how to think about decisions. And it's pretty straightforward. So there's really 3 inputs into how product managers make decisions. The 3 pillars of product decision making are intuition, feedback, and analytics. The best products get made when decisions are informed by all 3 of those inputs in a balanced way. But striking that balance is really, really difficult. People have a natural tendency towards a particular type of decision making, and teams have a natural balance towards a particular type of decision making. Some people are very intuitive. They really understand the craft of making good product. And because they have that good intuition, they bias towards that. Other people are very analytical. There's companies that really pride themselves on data, and they use data often to make decisions. And there's other companies that really listen to their customers and use their customers as a lead, and people that really like to use user research as an input into decision making. Each of these has benefits, and the way to make the best decision is actually to synthesize all of them together so that you're making balanced decisions. I'm going to talk about that in detail in terms of what that synthesis looks like and how it helps you make better decisions, and what some of the downsides are of over-relying on one of these decision-making pillars. Each of these ways of making decisions can lead to insight, but it can also blind you to what's really happening with users. And so ultimately that bias, if you really pull the thread on it and take it to an extent, blinds companies to the true nature of the market and opens them up to disruption from companies that are thinking about products from a more balanced perspective. So let's take a look at each mode of these each of these modes of decision-making in more detail. So the first mode of decision-making is intuition. Intuition is a sensibility about what a great product looks like for the customer. At its best, intuition leads to breakthrough products that disrupt markets. So decisions made using intuition are often generated from a person has a particular insight into where the market is going and has a thesis for that and builds towards that. The sensibility can be based on the taste of an individual. It can be based on the taste of a company culture. Apple, for example, is a really good example of good intuitive decision-making that's built into the culture. Often these intuitive decisions are made despite limited data or contrary to popular beliefs. One of the nice things about intuitive decisions is you can make decisions based on things that people can't see yet because you've intuited something about the market. Good intuitive decisions can lead to breakthrough products, and I'm going to talk about an example of that. And those breakthrough products can have a disruptive impact on their market. Most successful products, actually, most successful companies start with an intuitive insight. Google's a really good example. So Google began with the insight that the quantity of information on the internet was exploding faster than at any time in history, and that people needed a better way to search through that information. And that was really different at the time. Yahoo was taking a directory approach. Yahoo's approach was, we can actually curate the best information from the internet. Google's approach was very different. It was an approach saying, look, the narrowness of things that people are going to want to find within this, the needle in the haystack that people are going to want to find within this vast set of information is going to be fundamentally different than in the past, and you can't actually curate that. So let's look at an example of really good intuition. Apple is, I think, the prototypical example of that. Throughout its history, Apple has made successful products based on an intuitive sense of what the market wants. Oftentimes, there are some leading indicators within the market of where things are going, but Apple often is at its best when it's delivering something into the market that has never existed before. So people may not remember, but Steve Jobs actually got fired from Apple, and he came back years later when the company was struggling. And shortly after returning to Apple, he began to really think about Apple in a fundamentally different way than he had in the past. He started thinking about where the next great Apple product would come from. Steve had always loved music. He was a big Beatles fan. He loved, music was an important part of his life. And he was really disturbed by the awkward state of the market. So it was littered with these ugly devices. They were ill-conceived. They couldn't really deliver on the promise of digital music. Historically, music had been on cassette tapes and then ultimately on CDs. But the idea that music was going digital was something that early MP3 player manufacturers wanted to take advantage of, but they weren't really doing a great job with. They were really kind of pinned to the model of the past. So a lot of the MP3 players at the time looked like CD players or other types of devices that came before it. And Steve Jobs really felt that Apple could do better. And so ultimately what Apple delivered was the iPod, which is really the forebear to the iPhone, and fundamentally changed the trajectory of Apple as a company. So one of the things that was really important was with the iPod, Apple wanted to deliver a radically simpler MP3 player. It feels simpler, it looks simpler. But while it was simpler, it was not simple. Apple used all of its hardware savvy to solve important customer problems, the most important customer problems. So the iPod was smaller than many of the competitors, so it could actually fit in your pocket. And famously, Steve Jobs slipped it into his pocket during the keynote. It had more capacity. So rather than having 20 songs, you could actually have 1,000 songs. You could fit your entire music library on the device and bring it with you. And it had longer battery life so that you could listen all day. And it was much faster to load than other devices. So all of these insights about where the market needed to go synthesized into a product that was more than the sum of its parts. It was a new device, a new thing that people could use in a very different way. And it, of course, changed the face of digital music. It also turned Apple into a rocket ship. So since the iPod was released in 2002, Apple was valued at about $10 billion at the time. Today, Apple's valuation has grown nearly 100 times to $1 trillion company. And one of the things that's really important with intuitive insights is that they often fly in the face of prevailing wisdom. A very well-regarded journalist at the time was quoted as saying, all that hype for an MP3 player, breakthrough digital device, the reality distortion field is starting to warp Steve's mind if he thinks for 1 second that this thing is going to take off. So intuitive insights are the most valuable when the rest of the world is in the dark. Peter Thiel refers to this as knowing a secret. He believes groundbreaking companies are formed when the founder knows a secret that the rest of the world hasn't discovered and builds an idea, builds a product, builds a company around that secret. And as a result of knowing where the world is going before it happens, can do things that are really disruptive and breakthrough. Uber is a classic example of knowing a secret about how transportation could be much better, much more fluid, much more streamlined than before. So let's take a look at Apple's intuition. What exactly was their intuition? Their intuition was a leap, but it was also grounded in good strategy and smart analysis of a very large market. So Apple wasn't just making things up. They looked at what was happening and they developed something that could fundamentally solve for the very human needs, as well as deliver a device into a market that would become a large revenue driver for the company. Apple and Steve Jobs in particular correctly intuited that 1,000 songs in your pocket, so having your entire music library in your pocket, would change how people consume music. It would turn the MP3 player from a device into a constant companion, which is one of the reasons that it needed a longer battery life, and it needed to be able to fit into your pocket. Apple believed that people would pay a premium for devices that play such an important part of their lives. And today that seems kind of colloquial. It seems like, of course they will. Our phones are really attached to us. We're willing to pay a premium for something that is such an important part of our life and is such a constant companion. But that was a really new thing at the time. The fact that devices could be more than the cheapest possible electronics that actually serve the utility. And as a result of this premium positioning, strategically, Apple was able to sell devices at a much higher margin than other players and invest that back into R&D, which ultimately was the fuel that generated the iPhone. Apple also correctly believed the iPod would be a beachhead into a much larger market of companion devices and services. And so ultimately, Apple believed there was an opportunity to move the company from a computer company to a lifestyle company. And one of the things that was sort of foretelling of that is Apple changed its name from Apple Computer to just Apple after the iPod launch and after the strategy started to come into being. So good intuition can build great companies. It has time and time again, but bad intuition that's not informed by strategy, analytics, feedback can be destructive. Let's look at a case of that. So Evan from Snapchat has often been compared with Steve Jobs. And one of Snapchat's company's biggest strengths and one of his biggest strengths is an intuition about what young users want. The intuition around ephemerality, around messaging, around visual communication, and how that was changing led Snapchat to become one of the largest social platforms ever created. And at the time when Evan was talking about this, nobody else really understood what was happening in the market and the needs that he felt needed to be solved for young people that specifically were not being solved by Facebook. So that was his secret at the time. They built an incredibly successful company off of that intuition. And so in 2017, they went confidently into their next intuitive insight, that this idea of social and media needed to be separate, that by separating social from media, that will allow the company to create a more streamlined user experience that fulfills both use cases, but does so separately. This was an intuitive insight that the company had about what people wanted. And so they went into this redesign with that intuitive insight, built towards that, and then launched it all at once. But Snapchat would ultimately pay a price for its over-reliance on intuition and a disregard for analytics and customer feedback. And so after Snapchat's redesign, if people remember this in late 2017, early 2018, that led to a significant decline in Snapchat's stock price. It declined over 40% in the 12 months following the redesign. And throughout that, it's a textbook example of how Snapchat was continuing to rely on its intuition in the face of challenges rather than really listen to its users. At the time, I was at Facebook and we were doing a lot of research with teens, and we could hear loud and clear how frustrated they were with the redesign and how it changed how they could interact with their friends, and really for them undermined the core value proposition for Snapchat. And this discontent with Snapchat was coming from both individual users as well as the big celebrity influencers that were using the platform. So in February 21st, Kylie Jenner actually tweeted, "So does anyone else not open Snapchat anymore?" So very quickly, it got to the point where people were starting to move from Snapchat to other platforms. This was also a time when Instagram was starting to add stories in a more full-fledged way into the app and become a viable substitute for Snapchat. So Snapchat was slow to react. They continued to stand by the intuitive insight with the idea that eventually people would reshape how they were using the app to that intuitive insight. But customer feedback was really immediate and vocal, and people were voting, not just with their voices, but also with their feet. They were going and using Instagram instead. It took Snap 5 months to announce changes to the redesign. By that time, a lot of people that had used Snap had moved over to Instagram. And Snapchat's decision to stick with the redesign despite the controversy was actually reminiscent of Facebook's redesign to add newsfeed, where there was a similar amount of controversy. But I'm going to talk in a few minutes about why that was very different and why the end result was very different. So great companies often build on massively impactful insights, but the quality of intuitive decision-making can be hard to evaluate, and teams that over-rely on intuitive decisions risk swinging and missing a lot. So as a result, the tech industry has put significant priority on analytics, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. But a great example of a company that really changed is Snapchat. So Snapchat, since that time, their stock has increased fourfold. At the end of 2018, their stock was $5.71. It was $23.67 yesterday. And part of the reason was that Snapchat learned quickly. They built a data-centric growth team to complement the intuitive insights that they have. And they got much quicker about using data, about using customer feedback to understand the impact of the things that they were delivering, and start to deliver things in a much more iterative way, so that this kind of combination of analytical insight plus intuitive insight could be a fuel to drive growth, so that they wouldn't get into a situation like they had with the redesign, where they stuck by something that wasn't working for those 5 really critical months. So this is also a good lesson that we're all going to make mistakes, sometimes in a very big way, in the way that we make product decisions. But there's always an opportunity to refocus and try to restrike that balance between intuition, analytics, and customer feedback. So let's look at why analytics is so important. So analytical decisions are based on the insights generated as customers use the product. Analytics is not just about knowing SQL, it's about actionable conclusions. At its best, analytical decision-making enables products and companies to reach their maximum potential. Analytical decision-making is really in fashion right now, both because the results of analytical decision-making are easy to quantify, and because there's more data than ever before with which to make a decision. And so you can rely less on intuition because you have that data to tap into. Good analytical decision-making can provide the fuel that turns a spark into an inferno. And that's really something that we've seen kind of over and over again with Facebook. I often think about analytical decision-making as a way for you to enable your products to reach their full potential. Once you have product market fit, once you have that intuitive insight about what customers want, and you're starting to build on that secret, then analytics is the fuel that can help you grow that to the largest possible number of users who will get value from it. So Facebook in particular is a really good example of analytical decision-making. Specifically, Facebook's growth team is highly analytical, highly quantitative in the way that they approach the way that they build the things that they're launching and think about expanding into additional markets. So Facebook extended its initial market fit with college students that they achieved very well in 2004 and 2005 to 2 billion people. It's still today the largest product ever used. And they did this through rigorous testing and a usage of analytics to drive reach, engagement, and monetization. So I want to talk about an interesting example, which is Facebook's shift to the newsfeed. So the image on the left was what Facebook looked like in that 2004-2005 timeframe. It was once a disconnected set of profiles, not too dissimilar from MySpace and their pages. But then Facebook added newsfeed, and they fundamentally changed not just the trajectory of Facebook, but they fundamentally changed the fabric of social media. And the way that they got to this insight was through analytics. So through analytics, Facebook saw that users were logged in, and they went repetitively and tediously through every single one of their close friends to see what had changed about their profile. So this is something that's really core to Facebook's approach to product development. They often look for latent use cases to solve for by looking at the analytics. And then they use something that they know people are already doing, and then they streamline those activities. And in the process, they're able to, in a much less risky way, create new product innovation. And so this was a case where they were doing that. They felt like they could productize this use case of going from profile to profile, looking for updates into a single aggregated feed of updates, which they call the news feed. Intuitively and analytically, Facebook was confident that they had a big win on their hands. But what came next was a surprise. So this is a quote from Facebook product manager at the time. We woke up to hundreds of thousands of outraged people. Facebook groups like I Hate Newsfeed and Ruchi, who was the product manager at the time, Ruchi is the devil, had formed in the middle of the night. News reports and students were camped out in front of their offices. We had to sneak out of the back door to leave the office. So this was a product manager for Newsfeed recounting the day after they launched Newsfeed. I think most companies at the time would say, okay, we just got to get rid of this. This is too much of a backlash. But Facebook looked at it a little bit differently. So the largest group that had grown to protest Facebook newsfeed grew to 284,000 members in under 24 hours. In one form or another, 10% of Facebook's 8 million users at the time had threatened to boycott the company. It was one of the fastest and most viral backlashes to a product in history. And one of the reasons that it was such a fast backlash was thanks to the newsfeed. News was spreading about this boycott through the newsfeed. So while a vocal minority complained about what was happening on Facebook, Facebook saw that the overall engagement on the platform had doubled. In this same post that I quoted from, Ruchi talked about how she pored over the Facebook logs to understand how the feature was going. The attention to analytics enabled her to actually see a win where other companies might have seen disaster. And so ultimately what they decided to do was not to get rid of the feature. So amidst all the chaos, all the outrage, we noticed something unusual. Even though everyone claimed they hated it, engagement had doubled. So Facebook's analytical mindset enabled it to accomplish something that few companies would have. They enabled it to take something that might have on the surface be seen as a failure and turn it into one of the biggest wins in tech history. Facebook's analytics mindset starts at the earliest phases of the product. Many of Facebook's top features, newsfeed included, come from observing existing behaviors and creating functionality to support those behaviors. Facebook's true north is analytics. When they look for success, they really turn to analytics first. And this is one of the reasons they were able to see the success of the newsfeed rather than the PR response to the newsfeed. The other important point, which Rucha talks about in that quote, is Facebook watches data in real time and they move very, very quickly on it. It took hours, not days or weeks or months for Facebook to respond. So while Snap waited months to respond to their redesign backlash, Mark actually posted the same day to quell user concerns and talked about the fact that there were some concerns with newsfeed and how Facebook was going to address them. But he also talked about the increase in engagement that they were seeing. And that responsiveness helped pull the skeptics over the line and get them to really understand what Facebook was trying to accomplish through the news feed. So many analytical companies can use analytics to understand what's really happening with their users. But the other thing that I've seen is that many analytical companies can become too incremental because of an over-reliance on data. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that next. Facebook tries to overcome this by using analytics combined with intuition to inform the company's big intuitive bets. So for example, during the shift to mobile and during the process of separating Facebook and Messenger, Facebook relied really deeply on analytics to understand, should they make the decision to go with those big strategy changes? And then in the aftermath, were those changes the right thing for the company? And so analytics blazes the path to a product reaching its maximum potential. It really offers the key to how you get there. But at the same time, over-reliance on data and using data to the exclusion of feedback, to the exclusion of your intuition about what makes a good product, can lead to an incremental mindset. And then ultimately an incremental mindset is something that sets a company up for disruption. So let's look at an example of that. So I'm going to use an example from the vacation rental market. The market looks very different today due to the global pandemic. I put this data together before that. So let's look at it from the perspective of the pre-pandemic vacation rental world. So HomeAway is a very analytical company. They've talked a lot about having a scientific mindset to the way that they work. And it helped them become the 800-pound gorilla in the vacation rental market. Like many travel companies that do operate very quantitatively, HomeAway really excelled at analytics-driven growth. Since their IPO, they consistently delivered 20 to 30% annual growth and generate over $1 billion in revenue for Expedia, HomeAway's parent company. In 2015, they were purchased by Expedia for about $4 billion. One of the North Star metrics for vacation rentals in general and HomeAway in particular is the number of bookable listings. And we can see very clearly here, there's a pattern of consistent delivery on increases in bookable listings. It's a good example of how when you use analytics, when you're disciplined about it, you can drive continuous growth. But something else happened in the market. Sometimes the strongest incremental execution isn't enough to fend off really disruptive competitors. So Airbnb has quickly eclipsed HomeAway, and the company is now the leader in the vacation rental market. Like HomeAway, Airbnb is also very analytical. However, they strike a better balance in terms of strong intuition and customer research. They reframed the vacation rental transaction as a transaction between two people, not between an entity and another entity. Those two people are a host and a guest, and rather than treat it as a nameless business interaction, they treat it as a conversation between two people who were going to get to know each other in a way where one person was going to live in the other person's home for a short period of time. As a result, they were able to develop insights that disrupted the market and accelerated the growth way past the largest player, the incumbent in the space. Today, Airbnb is worth 10x the value of HomeAway because they combine that intuitive insight around the importance of that social relationship between the guest and the host with an analytical understanding of how to drive growth and scale that insight to impact the most number of users possible. So analytics is crucial to determining what's happening when people use a product, but it often falls short of why. The why can often make the difference between an incremental change and a disruptive insight. So the next mode of decision-making I want to talk about is feedback-based decision-making. And feedback-based decision-making is ultimately how you take intuition and analytics and you basically put together the things that you're learning there and color them in with a very empathetic understanding of your users. So feedback-based decisions are based on qualitative and quantitative research of existing and potential customers. At its best, feedback-based decision-making fosters empathy and covers the heart of what customers really want. And so that empathy piece is really important. I wrote a post recently about the fact that product management really is fundamentally at its core empathy. It's a matter of empathizing with your users, your customers, so that you can deliver something that really changes their lives and improves their lives. And it's empathizing with your team so that you can rally the people necessary to build that product that changes people's lives. This is a very famous quote from Albert Einstein. Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. So in the last several years, Silicon Valley has really fetishized database decision-making. There's no doubt that analytical decision-making has played a critical role in scaling the most widely adopted products ever created. At the same time, it's important to remember that human behavior, needs, and wants are not so easy to quantify. At the end of the day, we are all human. We are not data points. And Airbnb is one of the best examples of a company that understands the distinction between what can be counted and what counts. They seek to balance analytically driven product scaling with customer driven product development. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that looks like at Airbnb. So this is a quote from Brian Chesky on how Airbnb learned from its early users. So if you're only doing A/B tests, you're not designing with empathy. We didn't just meet our users, we lived with them. So in the early days of Airbnb, Brian would often go stay in the Airbnbs and get to know the hosts. And this was a really important part of him understanding at a very deep level what the host concerns were, what the guest concerns were. And these are the sort of insights that you're just not going to get through A/B testing. A/B testing can tell you whether or not one variant works better than another variant, but it can't tell you why. Customer-driven product development, the sort of development that Brian's talking about here, is in Airbnb's DNA. In a podcast, Master of Scale with Reid Hoffman, Brian talks about how building a startup really has two distinct phases. The first one is you want to design a magical experience for a handful of users. And so you really want to deeply empathize with users and figure out what is the experience that for them they couldn't even imagine, that's so great, so magical, that it's really life-changing for your users. Once you've designed that magical experience, then you can go and scale that experience to hundreds of millions of users. And so that really, in a nutshell, is that balance between Airbnb's customer-driven approach and analytical approach, and how they use those two modes of decision-making together and synthesize that into a much better solution for customers than they could relying on just data alone or relying on customer feedback alone. One of the techniques that Brian talks about in that podcast that they use is they ask the question, what would an 11-star experience look like? So what would an 11-star Airbnb check-in experience look like, as one example? And so the 1-star experience is really repulsive. If someone experiences that 1-star experience, they'll never come back to your product. And the idea with the 11-star experience is that it's life-changing, that it becomes something that is burned into their memory for the rest of their lives and something that they want to repeat at all costs. And so, let's look at what this might look like for a check-in experience. So a really bad 1-star experience is you go to check in at your Airbnb and the host is a no-show. And you're stuck on the street. There's nothing you can really do about it. I seem to have deleted the 2nd star, so I'll just go straight to the 3rd star. So the 3rd star experience is the host is late. And you have to wait 20 minutes. So you eventually do get into the Airbnb, but it's not a smooth experience. It keeps you waiting. You've already probably spent a lot of time traveling. You're tired from that. That's the last thing you want to do, is just kind of sit around and wait for 20 minutes before you get into your Airbnb. The 5-star experience is the host lets you in as soon as you arrive. So you get there and there's no friction whatsoever. And in some ways, the 5-star Airbnb experience is better than the 5-star hotel experience. With the hotel, you still have to park. You have to get your suitcases. You got to figure out where to park. You got to go to the front desk. You got to check in. They got to look up your reservation. Airbnb, it can be that much easier. You can get a code. You can type in your code. You can walk into your place and just have this really smooth transition from traveling to staying. The 6-star experience is the host lets you in and presents you with a welcome gift and stocks the fridge with water. So you've got a little gift, you feel welcome, you feel like you're in someone's home, and you're probably thirsty after all your traveling, and you have water and snacks to help you unwind. The 7-star experience is the host lets you in, shows you the fully stocked kitchen, and gives you the keys to his car. And he says, use my car whenever you like. We're now starting to get into the realm of impracticality, but you can start to see that this teases out some important elements of a great experience, which is anticipation of your future needs. And then the 11-star experience, which is magical and unbelievable, is that you get the same sort of welcome as the Beatles did in 1964 when they arrived in the United States. You get 5,000 screaming fans to meet you as you get off the plane. So clearly not something that you can deliver, but if you can sort of create the feeling that the host where you're arriving has anticipated with excitement your arrival and wants to do everything possible to roll out the red carpet, then that's really a magical experience that once you've defined, you can start to figure out emotionally, empathetically how you deliver that for the user. As Airbnb thought about moving beyond accommodations and into experiences, Airbnb wanted to discover what makes a magical trip. And so what they did was they actually said, let's implement the 11-star experience for real. And so they asked their users, they found one user, Ricardo, and they said, look, we're going to plan a trip. Ricardo had been to San Francisco. He didn't have a great experience. He spent a lot of time sort of alone wandering around the city. And so Airbnb said, can we actually turn that into a magical trip? So they offered to create the perfect trip for Ricardo at no expense barred. They storyboarded the perfect trip and they storyboarded it with Ricardo as the hero of its own story. They actually worked with Hollywood scriptwriters to say, here are the typical moments within a story. And here are the things that a hero might go through. How do we craft the same sort of hero-like experience for Ricardo? And so they crafted a deeply moving experience for a single traveler. And they asked, ultimately, after crafting that experience, how can we scale that to hundreds of millions of users? So Ricardo's magical trip consisted of a number of elements. It was a private limo picking him up from the airport versus having to hail a cab. It was a top-rated, luxurious Airbnb versus a budget hotel. It was reservations at San Francisco's top restaurants versus just walking into a restaurant where he could get a table. It was a private cocktail party thrown for Ricardo, where he got to meet a number of San Francisco locals and get a feel for the flavor of the city and meet people versus sitting alone at a bar hoping to strike up a conversation. And the culmination of the trip was a midnight mystery bike tour, which is one of the best rated attractions. And was an opportunity for him to be part of a community and experience San Francisco in a way that was really different than how a lot of people experienced it. And this was in contrast to, in his previous trip, he had a solo trip to Alcatraz. So by combining all of these elements into this perfect trip, Airbnb was able to really see the empathetical moments during a trip that deliver value and excitement and memorability to a person, and then take that understanding and translate it into their experience as product. So feedback is essential to understanding customers, but feedback also has to be used with judgment. So poor use of feedback can lead to over-optimizing for a vocal minority, overreacting to minor issues, or missing out on innovation opportunities. And so one of the common things that I see with people that want to integrate feedback into their product development process is they start to listen to the most vocal users, because those are the users that are most vocal. And oftentimes the most vocal users fall into two categories. This could be people talking about your product on Reddit or on other forums, or it could be people within your own company talking about the product. So people that are dog fooding the product, basically eating it for themselves. And the reason that people rely on these two methods is that user research takes a lot of resources. It takes a lot of time. And so if you can plug directly into conversations that are already happening, it's really compelling, and you should definitely do that. But it's important to recognize that the users who you're hearing from in those cases are a vocal minority. Often they are your power users. Either they're power users because they're in your company and they understand your product better than anyone possibly could in the market, or they're power users because they're on Reddit and they're talking about your product, which in and of themselves is a minority use case. And so several years ago, OKCupid was really focused on using these channels to understand what was happening with the average user on the product. And what they heard from these power users is that they wanted as many messages as possible. These users were spending a lot of time on OKCupid, and they had both the willingness and the ability to shift through messages that they were receiving. And this feedback that they got was actually in line with analytics. So analytically, they saw that retention was correlated with message volume. The more messages received, the more likely you are to come back. But what was also happening was that there was an important subset of new users who were not vocal because they were not heard from. They were not as incentivized to talk about the product because they weren't actively using it. And what was happening with this small but important set of, or this actually large but important set of new users, is that they were getting overwhelmed by messages when they came into the OKCupid platform. And this was particularly true for female users who are getting sometimes 50 messages in their first day. And so everything analytically, as well as from feedback, told OKCupid that if they start to throttle the number of messages received, that's going to decrease engagement. But ultimately, the solution was to fall back on their intuition and really empathize with the new user. We all know that going into a platform and just getting overwhelmed with messages is not an ideal experience, even if the analytics aren't saying that. And so they made an intuitive change. They throttled the number of messages that new users experience and gave them more opportunity to really deeply engage with those messages and make sure that they were getting messages from the right people. So this was a case of over-reliance on user feedback ultimately highlighted a problem, but where you fall back and you integrate intuition into that decision-making process, and you can get to a better outcome for users. So we have these three ways of making decisions. And for each way of making decisions, we can do it well or we can do it poorly. For intuition, done well, it leads to valuable insights that can have a disruptive impact. Done poorly, it leads to misguided investments and big misses. Analytics, done well, enables products to reach their maximum potential. Done poorly, results in incrementality, diminishing returns, and eventual irrelevance. It makes you open to disruption. Feedback, done well, leads to a deep and accurate understanding of customer needs. Done poorly, focuses on the vocal minority and misses out on opportunities that customers can't see and can't talk about. One of the important things about user research is that customers are not product managers, and so they don't know how to design features. And so ultimately, as a researcher, your goal is to understand their needs, not ask for solutions. And so all of these three modes of decision-making work together. Good intuition helps you synthesize analytics and feedback into valuable insights. Good analytics helps you support intuitive conclusions and validate research findings at scale. And good research improves a company's intuition and deepens an understanding of analytics. And so when you combine all of these together, you can make smart, balanced, valuable decisions that are both valuable for your customer as well as valuable for the companies. And doing this consistently well enables you to do three things. It enables you to find product market fit. It enables you to grow successful products to their maximum potential. And then most importantly of all, it enables you to find new sources of product market fit so that you can disrupt yourselves before competitors disrupt your company. And so ultimately that three pillars of decision-making, it's fundamentally important to making good product decisions. It's very hard to strike that balance. People gravitate towards a particular type of decision-making based on their strengths, based on their experience, based on company culture. But you as product managers and product builders can really restore balance to the organization by constantly being mindful to make decisions that draw upon all three: intuition, analytics, and feedback. So I'd be happy to take any questions.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions. Ravi, thanks so much for that super insightful presentation. So Anusha asks, any pointers on how to develop the analytics strategy for products, especially when you're releasing version 1 after the MVP?
Yeah, I think what's really important, and I've seen this with startups over and over again, is many startups start with an analytical insight because they have no data. And if your analytical insight is right, it can lead to building a really big company. And there's this interesting transition point when you release the V1 of your product where you now start to have data. And so I think there's two ways in which this can go wrong. One is that you don't make that transition successfully and you don't look as much at the data and you continue to rely on intuition. And the second is that you start to over rely on the data, and rather than solve customer problems, you start to try to move numbers. And in the early days, there's two challenges with that. The first one is that you oftentimes don't have enough statistical significance in the data to make as many decisions with it as you need to. And secondly, you often will get to a point where you're over focused on the data and not enough focused on the customer need that you're solving for. So I think a really important point to set up analytics well in V1 is pick one or two, but not more than that, metrics that you feel like are the best proxies for customer success. And ideally is a metric that you can measure at enough scale that you can get statistical significance, and really focus on that single metric. I think, now there's this ubiquity of data, and, there's a desire to want to report on everything that's happening. And pretty quickly you can get overwhelmed by the data, and the data becomes meaningless. But if you have one metric or a couple of metrics that are predictive and causal of customer success, and you focus on that, especially early on, you can start to move that metric and make the product better as a result. And then you can always shift that metric over time. I think one of the things that startups do as well is they often don't think enough about what's the weakest link in the chain right now, and how do we solve for that weak link. And that process of fixing those weak links, or the process of identifying things that are really working and expanding them, is something that requires constant change and constant updating.
Correct. Okay. Okay, we have a couple of questions regarding the career in product management, Ravi, since you've held various lead PM positions in all these companies. So people ask, what framework should PMs use to evaluate companies before taking up new roles, or how to gather how a product management, the way a company functions, the product management varies in different organizations. So can you shed some light on that?
Yeah, I think one of the important things for people to look at when they're looking at new roles is to really define for themselves what they're trying to accomplish for themselves in that role. And oftentimes, I think people are trying to accomplish one of two things. One thing that I hear a lot is PMs want to go into a company because they want to learn quickly and they want to improve their product management skills. The second thing that I hear a lot is people want to go into a company because they want their career to flourish. They want to move quickly up in the ranks. They want to manage a larger team and manage more scope and responsibility. And oftentimes those two things are at odds. I found that larger companies that have an established product management culture are often a great place to learn about product management, but are often not a great place to get the sort of fast-paced, at scope, at scale experience that helps you grow as a leader, builds up entrepreneurial instincts, and then ultimately I think makes for really great product careers. So the first thing I would ask yourself in terms of picking a new role is, what is the most important thing that you're trying to do? Do you want to maximize learning or do you want to maximize career growth and trajectory? And oftentimes what I see is that people early on in their careers want to maximize learning, establish a really good foundation, and then later on in their careers really want to focus on that career trajectory and make sure that their careers are moving as quickly as possible. Those are the ways that I would think about it from a career perspective. There's also just naturally the idea that you should work on products that you really love and where you're excited about the customers, you're excited about the product. And so if you're focused on learning, I think it's really important to understand the product organization. How are they organized? What are their processes? when you talk to product managers from that organization, you feel like you have a lot to learn from them. There are, of course, some organizations like Google and Facebook and others that have really great product organizations, and so you can kind of go in knowing that you're going to learn a lot. But there's also smaller organizations too that have really well run product teams where you can learn a lot. So there's a series of questions that you can ask there. And then if you're looking for a role where your career is going to grow really quickly, I'd ask yourself two questions. One is, is this a company that's growing quickly so I can grow with the company? And then the second one is, what does the team look like today? And as the opportunities come up, as the company grows, am I likely to get those opportunities and have an opportunity to grow with the company? So career growth, I think, is both a combination of, is the company growing? Are you in an environment that's growing? And then will you have the opportunity at that company to grow with it? Because you're going to be the person that's going to be tapped to take on roles of increasing scope and scale.
Correct. Okay. Here's an interesting one, Ravi. There are a couple of questions which say, can you talk about some of your failures? Can you shed some light on what some of your biggest product failures which have been, or some failures which you would like to share and reflect upon?
Yeah, I can talk about. So at Facebook, we were really trying to understand how teen usage of Facebook was changing over time and why teens wanted to move from Facebook to Instagram. And so part of what we were trying to do on the team was launch features on Facebook that we thought would be a really good fit for teens and would get them to continue to use the product rather than go to Instagram and Snapchat. One of the things that we released to that end was a very simple polling feature. So young people love polls. It's like really fun content to create. You can ask a question, you can see what your friends think about the question. It's really fun content to engage with. It's super low friction to engage with. People love to express their opinion. And there's a lot of examples of polling products that have done well with teens. There's some interesting products that work well with Snapchat. Instagram added the polling sticker to stories. And around the same time, we built a polling feature for Facebook where you could quickly create a visual poll. And we specifically decided to target teens with it and roll it out to teens. And we saw really good unit metrics. So good metrics around feature usage. Teens were significantly more likely to create the polls. Teens were significantly more likely to respond to the polls. And so, in terms of that particular feature, we accomplished what we wanted in terms of making that feature more engaging for teens, but we weren't at the same time seeing an increase in the retention of teens. So that particular feature wasn't actually accomplishing ultimately what our goal was, which was to keep teens on Facebook for longer. And the reason for that is I think a very common thing that you could see analytically, where you can get locally to a particular feature, you can get something to be successful, but it may not have the long-term implication that you want, either because there's extrinsic factors that are just overwhelming the value that feature provides, or because that feature might be interesting at that particular moment, but it doesn't generate the desire to want to continuously engage. And I think that's a really important lesson for product managers, is to not only understand how to create short-term engagement, but also create long-term value. And oftentimes those two can be very different. And one of the downsides of an over-reliance on analytics for decision-making is it's much easier to measure the short-term engagement than it is to measure the long-term value. And so as a result, people overemphasize the short-term engagement and don't spend enough on the long-term value. And I think that leads to what we see today is there's a lot of tech products that are potentially addicting, that drive really intense short-term engagement, but ultimately, as a result of that, people eventually disengage because they get burnt out. I think we saw that in the social game space with things like Farmville. I think we're seeing that today in certain things in the game space as well as the video space. And so your goal ultimately as a product manager is to combine both short-term engagement with long-term value and generate products that your customers want to use for a long time because it's adding value to their lives, and not products that your customers are addicted to and eventually burn out from.
Correct. Yeah. There's a question along similar lines here, which Karthik asks. How do you think about trade-offs between user-first metrics and business-first metrics? For example, if user-first metric moves up and the business-first metric moves down, would it be considered a success? So
yeah, I have a very strong opinion on this. So I think that ultimately the user first metrics are the business first metrics, and over a long enough period of time, your business will move in the direction that your users move in. And so if you solve problems for your users, you will, over the long term, create a more valuable business. The challenge is that that's over the long term. And, similar to what I just talked about, over the short term, you can actually increase revenue or generate some other type of business metric in a way that's not healthy for your users, and see an increase in the size of your business. And you could do that over the course of not just days, but you can do that over the course of quarters and maybe even years. But that idea of extracting value from your customer at their expense is not long-term viable. And I think if you look at the enduring companies in the tech industry, like Apple, like Microsoft, like Amazon, they have done a really good job of not always building their business as quickly as possible, but always building customer value as quickly as possible. And I'll give a recent personal example. So we watched a movie on Amazon Video the other day. The movie was fine. We didn't notice any problems with it. We had some glitches in the streaming, but nothing out of the ordinary. And a day later, I got an email from Amazon saying that we've auto-refunded your purchase of that movie because we didn't think that the video quality lived up to our standards. So they actively gave money back. I was not going to ask for a refund. I don't think the majority of people that get that auto-refund are going to ask for a refund. But they sent me a very clear signal, which is that we're not on other sides of the table here. We're on the same side. We want you to have a great experience and feel like you got value, and we're willing to give up revenue in order for you to have value. And very few companies have the discipline to give up that short-term revenue for that long-term deep relationship with the customer. But that's exactly the reason that Amazon is one of the most valuable, if not the most valuable company in the world. It's because customers have this implied trust that they've built up over time, and where they've shown willingness to do what's right for the customer, even if it's not right for the short-term business metric.
Perfect. Okay. Okay, so there are a lot of questions which revolve around how to be a better product manager, identify your shape as a product manager, how to develop your intuition. For those, I'll suggest please go check out Ravi's blog, the link of which he has shared on the screen. I will also just ping it in the chat because that would answer most of the questions which you have around being a better product manager. With that, Ravi, it's our time as well. We'll wrap up the discussion. So everyone, you will get a feedback form once you end the chat. Please do provide us with your feedback so that we can bring that in and improve on the future webinars. Again, thank you so much, Ravi. This was super insightful. I will also share your Twitter handle with the audience so that they can follow you there as well. And yeah, thanks so much for taking out the time. Really appreciate this.
That sounds great. Thank you for having me. And feel free to download the toolkit. You'll get signed up for the newsletter. And with that, you'll get my email address. So if you have any questions about how to put the tools into practice or any other questions that didn't get covered today, feel free to reach out to me.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you so much, Ravi.
Thank you.